There is a place in Texas where the sun rises every single morning, but some people haven't felt it on their skin in over 10 years. There is a place where men wake up, eat, think, pray, cry, and go to sleep all inside a space smaller than your bathroom. There is a place where you can go an entire year without anyone touching your hand, without anyone patting you on the back, without a single hug. And the most chilling part, some of the men inside this place have been there for 30 years, still waiting, still alone. This is not a horror movie. This is not fiction. This is a real building, sitting quietly in the middle of Livingston, Texas. It is called the Polunsky Unit, and what happens inside its walls is something most people will never hear about, never read about, and never have to think about. But today, you're going to hear about it. If this is the kind of story that makes you think, makes you question things, and makes you see the world a little differently, then make sure you subscribe right now and turn on the bell so you never miss a story like this one. This channel goes where most people are afraid to go. You're going to want to be here for what comes next. Now, let's go inside. The Polunsky Unit is a maximum security prison, but it is not like the prisons you've seen in movies. No crowded cafeterias, no inmates lifting weights together in the yard, no card games, no chessboards, no long tables full of men eating and arguing and laughing. None of that. The men on death row at Polunsky live alone. Each man gets his own cell. That cell is about 60 square feet. To help you picture that, stand in your bedroom. Now imagine shrinking it down until it is just slightly bigger than a king-size bed. That is your world. That is your kitchen, your bedroom, your living room, your bathroom. Everything, all in one tiny box. The door to that cell is not made of bars like you see in old movies. It is a solid steel door. You cannot see through it. You cannot really hear through it easily. When it closes completely, and it only opens for very specific reasons: a shower, a medical visit, 1 hour of what they call recreation. That is it. Meals come through a small slot at the bottom of the door. They call it the bean slot. A tray slides in. You eat. The tray slides back out. You don't see the person who brought it. You don't really talk to them. The whole thing is over in a few seconds. Breakfast arrives at 3 in the morning. Not 7, not 8, 3 in the morning. While you are deep asleep or trying to be, a tray is being slid through a slot in your door. Lunch comes around 10:30. Dinner comes at 4:30 in the afternoon. After that, there is no more food, no snacks, no trips to the kitchen, nothing until 3 in the morning again. And then the silence comes back. The silence at Polunsky is one of the first things people talk about when they describe life on that unit. It is not peaceful silence. It is heavy silence. The kind that presses down on your chest. The kind that makes your own thoughts louder than you want them to be. Because when there is nothing to look at, nothing to do, and no one to talk to, your mind starts working overtime. It starts replaying things, old conversations, old mistakes, old faces, and it does not stop. Now, here is where the story starts to get interesting, because what you would expect to happen to a person trapped in those conditions is a complete mental collapse, total breakdown. And for some men, that is exactly what happens. But for others, something else happens entirely. Something that researchers, psychologists, and even prison officials did not fully predict. Some of these men found a way to survive. Not just physically, but mentally, emotionally. Some of them found ways to stay sharp, stay sane, and even stay connected to the world outside those steel doors. And the ways they did it will genuinely surprise you. But first, you need to understand just how extreme those conditions really are. Because the word alone does not fully capture it. Alone is sitting by yourself at lunch. Alone is spending a Friday night in your apartment with nobody to call. That kind of alone is uncomfortable, but it is manageable. Most people can handle it for a few hours, maybe a day or two. What happens at Polunsky is a different species of alone. The official term for it is solitary confinement, but even that phrase has been softened so much over the years that it no longer fully lands. So let us be precise about what it actually means in this specific place. 22 to 23 hours per day, every single day, in that 60 square foot cell. Alone. No exceptions for good behavior. No way to earn your way to a different arrangement. From the day you arrive on death row at Polunsky, regardless of who you are, regardless of how calm or cooperative or harmless you might be, you go into that cell. And you stay there. Every single day, Monday through Friday, you are allowed 1 hour outside your cell. But even this 1 hour is not what you might imagine. You are not taken to a shared yard where you can talk to other people. You are placed in your own individual cage. It is bigger than your cell, but you are still alone in it. You can pace. You can do push-ups. You can look at the sky, but you cannot touch another human being. On weekends and holidays, even this 1 hour disappears. On those days, the only time you leave your cell is to take a shower. And even a shower is not simple. Before you can go, guards must strip search you. 2 officers, every time, just to walk down the hallway, take a shower, and come back. There is no television. Texas is one of only 2 states in the entire country where death row inmates are not allowed a TV. You cannot sit on your bunk and watch the news, watch a movie, watch anything. The screen that billions of people on Earth use to kill time, to laugh, to learn, you don't have access to it. You have a small window in your cell. It is positioned in a way that lets in some light, but it does not exactly give you a view of the world. Outside is there, but barely. Like a photograph of something you used to know. Phone calls are allowed. 1 call every 90 days. 5 minutes. Think about that. 5 minutes of hearing a voice you love. Every 3 months. That is your connection to the outside world. Those 5 minutes have to carry everything. Every update, every question, every piece of comfort that voice can give you. And then it is gone again. For another 90 days. Visits are allowed. Families can come. But when they sit down across from you, there is a thick sheet of plexiglass between you. No hugs. No handshakes. No physical contact of any kind. You look at each other. You talk through a phone on each side of the glass. And when the visit is over, you go back behind the steel door, and they go back to the world. For many inmates, the guards placing them in restraints before a shower or a visit is the only physical human contact they experience. The only time another person's hands are on them is when they are being controlled. This is the daily reality. Day after day, week after week, year after year. And yet, here is what nobody tells you: the prison population at Polunsky is not a population of men who have simply given up. Researchers who have interviewed these men, journalists who have spent time at the unit, and even former prison staff who have spoken publicly about what they witnessed, all of them report the same unexpected thing. Resistance. Quiet, stubborn, creative resistance. Not resistance with weapons or riots. Resistance with paper, with pencils, with prayer, with voices shouted through steel doors, with tiny folded notes passed under cell floors by inmates acting as informal mailmen, with letters sent to strangers in other countries who responded with more letters, with drawings made on paper tablets, with religious texts read and reread until the pages were soft. These men built something inside those walls. Something invisible, but real. Something that kept a significant number of them from completely falling apart. And one of the most surprising tools they used to survive, a tool that came from the most unexpected direction, was something that arrived quietly during a global crisis. Something that the prison staff almost didn't allow. Something so ordinary on the outside that you would never guess it could mean the difference between a man holding on and a man letting go. We are going to get to that. And when we do, it is going to reframe everything you thought you knew about what human beings actually need to survive. But right before we get there, there is something you need to know about what happened in 1999. A single decision made by the Texas prison system. A decision that changed everything for the men on death row. A decision that, according to researchers, mental health professionals, and the inmates themselves, made life inside Polunsky dramatically harder than it had ever been before. Some people believe that decision was necessary. Others believe it was one of the most damaging things ever done to a group of prisoners in modern American history. The evidence, and there is a lot of it, points in a very specific direction. Drop a comment below and tell me, do you think complete isolation makes a prison safer, or does it make things worse? I want to know what you think before we get into what the numbers actually say. Because what happened after 1999 is where the story truly begins to crack open. Before 1999, death row in Texas looked different. Not better in every way, not comfortable, not easy, but different in one very important way. The men on death row were not completely alone. They were housed at a place called the Ellis Unit, and at Ellis, death row inmates could move. They could leave their cells and go to a shared space. They could sit next to another human being. They could have a conversation that did not involve shouting through a steel door. They had jobs, actual work assignments inside the prison. Some of them worked in the garment factory. Some of them worked in the kitchen. Some of them pushed mops down hallways and exchanged a few words with the man mopping the hallway next to them. None of this was freedom. Let's be clear about that. These were still men who had been sentenced to death. They were still locked inside a prison, but they had something that researchers now understand is not a luxury, it is a biological necessity. They had human contact. And then, in 1999, the Texas Department of Criminal Justice made a decision. They moved the entire death row population to a brand new facility, the Polunsky Unit, built specifically for them. Modern, clean, organized, and completely, deliberately isolated. Every man got his own cell. Every man lost his job. Every man lost the shared spaces, the shared meals, the shared anything. The small daily moments of human contact that had kept many of them mentally anchored gone. Overnight. The reason given by officials at the time was security. There had been an escape attempt at Ellis in 1998. One inmate had managed to get out temporarily before being recaptured. The new facility, they argued, would make death row safer for guards, for staff, for everyone. And on paper, the argument made sense. But what happened in the years after 1999 told a very different story. Mental health professionals who worked inside Polunsky began to notice things. Psychiatrists and counselors filed reports. Researchers from universities requested access to study the population. Journalists started asking questions. And slowly, the picture that emerged was not the picture of a safer, more controlled environment. It was the picture of men breaking down. The rate of mental illness on death row climbed. Serious psychological deterioration, the kind that shows up as a man screaming at the walls, or refusing to leave his cell, or spreading filth on every surface he can reach, became something guards and staff had to deal with regularly. One inmate attempted to take his own life 12 times. 12. He eventually refused to leave his cell for years, not because he was being difficult, but because the space between his cell and the rest of the world had become something he could no longer navigate. At least 8 men on death row at Polunsky died by suicide over a 20-year period. 8 men who, in the end, could not find a way to hold on. And here is the thing that makes this even harder to sit with. Researchers who studied both the Ellis era and the Polunsky era found something stark. The same population of men under the same sentence, in a state-run facility, but after the move to Polunsky, the psychological damage was measurably, significantly worse. In 2017, the University of Texas Human Rights Clinic published a report. They called it something that said exactly what they found. They called it designed to break you. Those 3 words were not chosen carelessly. Now, if you've been watching this far, and this story is hitting different for you, do yourself a favor and subscribe right now. And share this video with one person who you think needs to see it. Because what we're about to get into is the part that most people never hear. The part where, in the middle of all of this darkness, something completely unexpected started to happen. Because not everyone broke. And the ones who didn't break, the ones who found a way to stay human inside a system that the University of Texas said was designed to do the opposite, they did it in ways that nobody planned, nobody funded, and nobody fully understood until researchers started paying close attention. Let's start with the most basic survival tool of all: routine. When you have nothing, routine becomes everything. The men who lasted at Polunsky without falling apart were almost universally described by researchers and by themselves as people who imposed structure on their days. Not because the prison gave them structure, the prison schedule was deliberately disorienting, with breakfast at 3 in the morning and nothing to do for the remaining 23 hours, but because they created their own. Wake up at the same time every day. Exercise first. Push-ups, sit-ups, pacing the length of the cell back and forth. Read for a set number of hours. Write for a set number of hours. Pray or meditate at a specific time. Sleep at a specific time. It sounds simple, but psychologists who study extreme isolation, including researchers who have studied what happens to people trapped alone in caves, or stranded at sea, or held in captivity, all point to the same finding. The people who survive mentally are the ones who build a clock inside themselves when the outside world stops giving them one. Routine is not comfort. In extreme isolation, routine is armor. Letters were another lifeline, and this one is bigger than it sounds. Inmates at Polunsky were allowed to send and receive mail, and many of them built entire worlds through paper and ink. They wrote to family members. They wrote to lawyers. They wrote to strangers. Organizations around the world connected death row inmates with pen pals, regular people in other countries who had never been to Texas, never been to prison, never met a person on death row who agreed to write back. And those letters became something extraordinary. One inmate described receiving a letter late at night. Mail at Polunsky often arrived close to midnight as the single best moment of any given day. Not because of what was in the letter necessarily, but because the letter itself was proof. Proof that somewhere out there, a real human being had sat down, thought about him, written words on paper, put it in an envelope, and sent it. That someone, somewhere, considered him worth the effort. For a man who had not been hugged in 3 years. For a man whose only phone call in 90 days lasted 5 minutes. For a man whose only physical contact was being placed in restraints, that letter meant something that is genuinely difficult to put into words. Some inmates became prolific writers. Not just letters, essays, poetry, detailed accounts of daily life, philosophical reflections. One inmate, Randy Halprin, kept journals so detailed and so thoughtful that they were published online and read by people across the world. He wrote about everything: the sound of the unit at night, the way light moved through his small window, the thoughts that came to him at 4 in the morning when sleep wouldn't come. His writing became a kind of bridge between the inside of that cell and the outside world. Others turned to art. Paper tablets and pencils were permitted, and some men became genuinely skilled artists, drawing portraits, landscapes, detailed scenes from memory. One man made elaborate wooden objects, jewelry boxes, small clocks, and mailed them to people around the world. These were not the actions of men who had given up. These were the actions of men who were fighting, quietly, with whatever they had. Religion played a massive role for many. The Polunsky Unit had chaplains, and the unit had what they called field ministers, inmates from other parts of the prison who had completed theology degrees, and were allowed to walk the death row corridors without a guard escort. They were, for many death row inmates, the only human beings who visited them regularly and treated them as people rather than inmates. Several death row inmates described conversations with field ministers as the moments that kept them from the edge. But not everyone found comfort in religion. Some lost their faith entirely. A Texas Observer survey of 292 death row inmates found that many of the men had not found God in their cells. Some had moved away from religion altogether, turning instead to philosophy, secular meditation, or simply the discipline of thought as a coping mechanism. One inmate described adopting a stripped-down version of Buddhism, not the religious ceremonies or the rituals, but the mental practice, the training of attention, the deliberate choice, every single day, to focus on what was in front of him rather than what was behind him or what might be coming. These are not small things. These are not feel-good details thrown in to soften a hard story. These are documented, studied, verified survival strategies used by real men in real cells in a real building that is still standing right now in Livingston, Texas. And they worked. Not for everyone, not perfectly, not without cost, but they worked well enough that a significant number of men who had been in those cells for 5 years, 10 years, 15 years were still mentally present, still thinking, still writing, still reaching out through whatever crack in the wall they could find. But here is where the story takes a turn that nobody, not the inmates, not the researchers, not even the prison officials, saw coming. In 2020, the world shut down. A virus moved across the planet and locked billions of people in their homes. Schools closed. Offices closed. Restaurants closed. People who had never experienced anything close to isolation suddenly found themselves alone in their apartments for weeks, unable to visit family, unable to touch friends, staring at walls and wondering how long it would last. And inside the Polunsky Unit, inside those 60-square-foot cells, behind those solid steel doors, the men on death row watched it happen. Some of them had been in isolation for over a decade, and now, the entire outside world was getting its first small taste of what they had been living every single day. But the pandemic didn't just bring a strange kind of dark irony to Polunsky. It brought something else entirely. Something that started as a small idea from one person, a warden, who made a decision that most people in his position probably wouldn't have made. He decided to give the men something to listen to. What happened next is the part of this story that stops people cold when they hear it for the first time. Because what grew out of that decision quietly, inside a maximum security prison, during a global pandemic, among men that most of the world had written off completely, was something that nobody predicted. And the effects of it were so measurable, so clear, so documented that it forced even the most skeptical observers to ask a question they had never seriously considered before. What do human beings actually need to stay human? That answer is coming, and it is not what you think. Drop a comment right now and tell me, after everything you've heard so far, what do you think kept these men going? What do you think made the difference? Write it below. I want to see your answers before we get into what actually happened, because some of you are going to be very close, and some of you are going to be completely surprised. Either way, the final part of this story is unlike anything we've covered so far. A radio station. That is what the warden gave them. Not therapy sessions. Not new furniture. Not extra phone calls or longer visits or any of the things that researchers had been recommending for years. A radio station, broadcasting from inside the Polunsky Unit itself, on 106.5 FM. Reachable by any small transistor radio that inmates were allowed to keep in their cells. It sounds almost too simple, almost too small to matter. But what happened after that radio station turned on is one of the most quietly remarkable things to come out of any American prison in recent memory. The station was called the Tank, and from the moment it launched during the height of the pandemic, when the world outside was barely functioning and the world inside Polunsky had become even more suffocating than usual, it became something that nobody had a word for yet. Not just entertainment, not just noise, something closer to oxygen. The programming was run by inmates from the general population side of the prison. Not death row. Those men were still locked behind their steel doors, still alone, still unable to participate directly. But the warden, Daniel Dickerson, made a specific decision. He carved out an exception. Death row inmates could submit written material, essays, poems, personal reflections to the chaplains. The chaplains would carry those pages across the unit and deliver them to the DJS, and the DJS would read them on air. Think about what that means for a moment. A man who cannot leave his cell. A man who has not had a real conversation with another inmate in years. A man whose voice has essentially disappeared from the world suddenly. That man could write something, and within days, his words would travel through the air of the entire prison. Other inmates would hear them. Guards would hear them. Staff walking the corridors would hear them. And through radios placed near windows, sometimes people just outside the prison walls could hear them too. For the first time in years, these men had an audience. Not a judge. Not a lawyer arguing their case. Not a guard giving them orders. A real audience. People listening because they wanted to. People who heard the words and responded, sometimes with dedications, sometimes with letters, sometimes just by listening in silence, which is its own kind of acknowledgement. The programming on the Tank was not what you might expect from a prison radio station. There was R&B, there was rap, there was heavy metal, there were religious services broadcast on Sunday mornings, there were shows about health and wellness, there were what inmates called shout-outs, dedications sent from one person to another, the way radio stations used to do before streaming took over. There were even shows about stocks and personal finance, which might seem strange until you realize that these men were not thinking about money, they were thinking about relevance, about being connected to a world that still moved, still changed, still had a future in it. And then there were the essays from death row. Some of them were angry, some of them were sad, some were funny in the dry, sharp way that only comes from a person who has had nothing to do but think for 10 years. Some were philosophical, some were just descriptions of a single morning. What the light looked like, what sounds came through the door, what thoughts arrived before breakfast. But all of them shared one thing. They were honest in a way that most public writing never is. Because when you have nothing left to protect, when your reputation is already gone, and your freedom is already gone, and the only thing you still fully own is the inside of your own mind, you write the truth. Raw and clean and unfiltered. People outside the prison started listening. Journalists picked up the story. And when researchers began looking at what the tank was doing to the psychological climate of the unit, what they found was not subtle. Incidents of self-harm went down. The number of men acting out the screaming, the destruction, the visible psychological unraveling that guards had come to treat as routine decreased. Suicides did not stop entirely, because no radio station can carry that much weight alone. But the overall atmosphere inside the unit shifted in a direction that even the most skeptical staff members acknowledged. One former mental health director who had worked at Polunsky said it plainly, giving these men a way to be heard without being judged for what they had done was something the entire professional mental health infrastructure of the prison had failed to provide. A radio station, built on almost no budget, run by inmates, did what years of official programming had not. And that is not a criticism thrown carelessly. It is just what happened. But the tank was not the only unexpected development at Polunsky. Because in February of 2024, 25 years after the move from Ellis that stripped death row inmates of all communal life, the warden made another decision. He launched a group recreation program. A small group of death row inmates were selected to participate in a trial. Instead of their 1 hour alone in an individual cage, they were brought together. They could exercise in the same space. They could watch television for the first time, in some cases, in over a decade. They could play games. They could sit next to another human being without plexiglass between them, without restraints, without a specific clinical reason for the contact. They could just exist together, like people. The responses from the men who participated were immediate and almost identical across every account that was reported. One inmate said it made him feel like a person again. Another said he had forgotten what it felt like to laugh at something with someone else in the room. Another described the simple act of watching television with another human being as something he had not realized he missed until it happened, and something inside him that had been clenched for years just released. These are not dramatic statements. These are not men performing for cameras or saying what they thought people wanted to hear. These were private responses recorded by researchers and journalists and chaplains. Quiet, almost confused expressions of something that had come back to life, that they thought was gone forever. The program was not perfect. It was a trial. It was small, and in early 2025, a second version of the program was suspended. The exact reasons were not made fully public. So the story is not a clean, happy arc. It is not a movie ending where the system fixes itself and everyone is saved. It is messier than that. It is more human than that. Because this entire story is more human than most people are comfortable admitting. Here is the part that tends to sit with people the longest after they've heard all of this. The things that kept these men alive mentally, emotionally, spiritually alive were not complicated. They were not expensive. They were not the result of advanced psychological programs or innovative therapeutic techniques. They were letters. They were books. They were drawings on paper tablets. They were voices heard through a small radio. They were words passed under a door on a folded piece of paper. They were field ministers who walked the corridor and spoke to them like they were still somebody. They were 5-minute phone calls where just the sound of a familiar voice on the other end was enough to get through another week. They were the most basic human things in the world. And this is the part of the story that reaches through the walls of that prison and lands directly on the outside. Because what these men discovered not by choice, not by experiment, but by pure desperate necessity is something that psychologists have been saying for decades, but that modern life has somehow made easy to forget. Human beings do not just want connection, they require it. The same way a body requires food and water and air, the mind requires the sense that it exists in relation to other minds, that it is seen, that it matters to someone, that somewhere, a real person knows your name and is willing to hear what you have to say. Strip that away completely, and the damage is not metaphorical. It is physical. It shows up in brain scans. It shows up in behavior. It shows up in the slow, quiet unraveling of people who had every intention of holding themselves together and restore even a fraction of it, even through something as simple as a radio station playing inside a prison, and something comes back. Not everything, but something real, something measurable, something that proves the need was never gone, just buried under years of silence. There are currently over 200 men on death row at the Polunsky Unit. Each of them is in a cell right now. Tonight, as you watch this, some of them are reading, some of them are writing letters, some of them are pacing, some of them are listening to the tank if it is still on air, some of them are staring at the ceiling thinking thoughts that nobody on the outside will ever know. Some of them have been there for 30 years. Some of them arrived last month. Some of them will be executed. Some of them will have their sentences changed. Some of them will die in that cell of old age or illness before either of those things happens. But all of them, every single one, woke up this morning in a 60-square-foot box, ate breakfast at 3 in the morning, and found some way to make it through another day. Whether you think they deserve to be there or not, whether you agree with the death penalty or not, whether their crimes were the worst things you have ever heard or not, the question this story leaves you with is not about them specifically. It is about what we now know about human beings in general. We know what complete isolation does. We have studied it, measured it, documented it. We know it breaks people. We know it causes damage that does not repair itself when the isolation ends. We know that a man who has spent 20 years in a 60-square-foot cell does not walk out the same person who walked in, even if he fought every single day to hold himself together. We know all of this. The evidence is not disputed. And yet, the Polunsky Unit is still standing. The steel doors are still closing every night. The bean slots are still opening at 3 in the morning. The question of what to do with that knowledge, that is not one this video can answer for you. That is the question you carry with you when it ends. What we can say, with certainty, is this. The men inside those walls found something that the people who built those walls did not account for. They found that the human need to matter to someone to reach through whatever barrier exists and make contact with another mind is not something that can be fully contained by concrete and steel. It finds a way, through paper, through pencil, through a folded note slid under a door, through a voice on a small radio, through a letter from a stranger in another country who just decided, one day, to write. It always finds a way. And maybe that is the most surprising thing this place, this quiet, terrible, fascinating place in the middle of Texas, has to teach us about what it means to be alive. If this story made you think, if it shifted something in the way you see things, then subscribe and share this video with someone who needs to hear it. This channel tells the stories that don't make the front page, about the parts of the world that most people walk past without looking. If that is the kind of content you want more of, you know what to do. We will see you in the next one.